Item 10 of the Standing Committee on International Trade. Before we begin, I need to ask all members and others in-person participants to consult the cards on the timelines to prevent audio feedback incidents. Please take note of the following preventative measures in place to protect the health and safety of all participants. Use only a black approved earpiece. Keep your earpiece away from all microphones at all times, and when you are not using the earpiece, please place it face down on the sticker that's on the table. Thank you for your cooperation. Today's meeting, of course, is taking place in a hybrid format. Members in the room, please raise your hands if you wish to speak. For members on Zoom, please use the raise hand function, and we will manage the speaking order. Pursuant to Standing Order 182 and the motion adopted by the committee on Tuesday, October 17, 2023, the committee is resuming a study of the 2026 CUSMA review. With us, we have today people who we are very familiar with, who have been with us several times. From the Automotive Parts Manufacturers Association, Flavio Volpe by video conference. Good to see you again. From the Canadian Agri-Food Trade Alliance, Michael Harvey, Executive Director. Canadian Produce Marketing Association, Ron Lemaire, President. Digital Media Association, Graham Davies, President and Chief Executive Officer by video conference. And the National Cattle Feeders Association, Janice Tranberg, President and Chief Executive Officer by video conference. Welcome to you all. We will start with opening remarks and then proceed with rounds of questions. Mr. Volpe, I invite you to make an opening statement of up to 5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, members of the committee. Thank you, staff of CIIT, for inviting the APMA back again to talk about our favorite topic, trade within the Americas. The Automotive Parts Manufacturers Association is the national association representing automotive suppliers to the global original equipment makers or car makers market. We represent over 200 companies and 95% of independent parts production in this country. In a normal, non-constricted year, that capacity is about $35 billion worth of components and systems, employing directly about 100,000 people. The APMA took part in the original NAFTA renegotiations from 2017 to 2019 in earnest, working closely with officials both in Ottawa, but as well as Mexico City and Washington, D.C. We attended every round, all 7 rounds and one unofficial round of the negotiations, with a view to improving and updating the rules of origin as they pertain to automotive supply. Together with the leadership, especially of the Canadian negotiating team in automotive, the results were that the new rules represented, in our estimation, about 25% higher volume for Canadian-based supply into the North American automotive market, and that probably means $6 to $8 billion in incremental business every year. As we prepare for the inevitable conversation, the renewal of the USMCA, with either a new or a re-elected American administration and a new Mexican administration, the focus for the automotive sector is twofold. Both of them fall under the same context. 80% of the business that we do in this country, 80% of the cars that we make in Canada are exported to the U.S. The U.S. market is the best indicator, the U.S. Vehicle market is the best indicator of the Canadian manufacturing sector's prospects. We always harmonize in automotive our regulations and the other tools that govern and shape the market with the Americans. The Americans, after we concluded the NAFTA, the new NAFTA, the CUSMA, changed their interpretation of roll-up, which in layperson's terms is you have to qualify a subcomponent at a certain percentage local content before it becomes part of the equation for whether the vehicle has met its local content requirement for tariff-free sale. The new administration had a different interpretation of roll up, a stronger one of what was required to qualify than the one that the three countries agreed on. And Canada and Mexico joined together in a USMCA dispute claim, which ultimately a USMCA panel ruled in favor of Canada and Mexico over the US. We're waiting still for the Americans to come to the table with a response and to comply with the ruling. And it is of concern for the parts sector, especially because it changes very clearly how we interpret supply logistics and content. And then in China and on EV mandates in Canada, we've pushed for 100% EV or zero emission vehicle sale by 2035, as well as in the US. But the curves are different. The markers in Canada are higher than the US in those 11 years between now and then, and it is of concern to us. And I think it will be part of the USMCA discussion with the Americans, as well as the Americans have now launched tariffs against vehicles, Chinese source vehicles, and critical minerals that Canada has not indicated whether it's going to respond and match or do something materially in the same. And we think that that's going to be a very important context in how the Americans view our view of our renewing relationship for 2026. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Volpe. Mr. Harvey, for up to 5 minutes, please.
Bonjour et merci aux membres du comité.
Good morning, or hello, and thank you to the members of the committee for inviting me here. CAFTA, the Canadian Agri-Food Trade Alliance, is a coalition of national organizations that advocates for a freer and fairer international trading environment for the agriculture and agri-food sector. A fair and open international trading environment for the agri-food sector is in Canada's economic interest. Agri-food accounts for 1 in 9 jobs in Canada, and most are in the export-oriented agri-food sector. More than half of our production is exported or processed for exportation.
Hold on a second, Mr. Harvey. We're just checking for translation.
In terms of volume of the English translation?
Can
I could
everybody
hardly.
do we have to turn it up?
I apologize.
Oh, no worries.
Mr. Harvey, can you sit back a little bit as you continue?
Sure.
Give it a try again.
Is this better?
Okay. Say something else.
Am I better now? Est-ce que ça va mieux
I think it's the
maintenant?
interpreter.
Is it better now? Is it better now? Do you hear me better? Less loud?
Their button turned up maximum? Okay, Mr. Harvey, give us another sentence, please.
Okay. Is it better now? Est-ce que ça va mieux maintenant?
Is it better now?
Continue, Mr. Harvey. We'll
Okay.
stop you if necessary.
Sure. CAFTA's priorities are as follows. 1, to open new markets for Canadian agri-food. 2, to uphold the international rules-based trading system. 3, to strengthen trade diplomacy capacity and industry-government collaboration. The United States is Canada's largest agricultural trading partner by far, buying 59.2% of Canadian exports and supplying 57% of Canadian imports. Canada is the leading agricultural trade partner of the United States when exports and imports are combined. Canada ranks among Mexico's leading agri-food suppliers, period. Mexican agri-food imports from Canada reached $2.9 billion in 2022. Mexico's large population, growing middle class, geographic proximity, and political stability make it an important market for CAFTA exporters. The deep integration between the Canadian and U.S. agricultural sectors is largely a question of proximity, but trade agreements and a deep positive relationship with our American friends and allies are also vital. The Canada-U.S. Free Trade Agreement of 1989, followed by NAFTA in 1994, then CUSMA in 2020 have dismantled most tariff and quota barriers to Canada-U.S. agricultural trade. I want to underline that for Canada-U.S. agri-food trade, CUSMA benefits trade and investment for both countries through highly integrated supply chains. This includes intra-industry trade for important sectors where each country exports products to the other within these sectors. Pork and beef are important examples, as well as grains and feeds, where bilateral trade covers many semi and finished processed products, such as sugar-containing ingredients and food products. Our supply chains are so deeply integrated that in essence, our countries are producing together, making technological advances together, and using an integrated transportation system. These are important elements to emphasize when interacting with U.S. counterparts. Napoleon famously said that geography is destiny. This is clearly true for Canada's international trading relationships. Nothing is more important than our relationship with the United States. CAFTA is a strong supporter of the diversification of our trading relationships, but the U.S. will always be the most important. In an increasingly uncertain international environment, neighbors and partners like the U.S. and Mexico must be carefully nurtured. Our security relationship, border management, and the management of key trade infrastructure cannot be separated from the trading relationship. As a country, we must manage North American relations holistically. CAFTA members can play a useful role in the Team Canada approach by working with their U.S. counterparts to underline the importance of CUSMA to them. U.S. farmers and producers are politically relevant, including in key swing states. Enfin,
And finally, I wish to emphasize the need to avoid unnecessarily provoking U.S. trade negotiators. CAFTA firmly believes that Bill C-282, which would prevent Canadian negotiators from discussing tariff quotas in supply-managed industries, is a red flag to U.S. interest groups in key states. We are asking the Senate to reject Bill C-282, which has not been thoroughly studied in the House. I'd be happy to answer any questions you may have. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Harvey. Mr. Lemire, please, for up to 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair and committee members, for the opportunity to come today to speak on the potential issues for consideration in relation to the 2026 review of the Canada-U.S.-Mexico Trade Agreement. As the committee has heard me say in the past, our produce supply chain is highly integrated across borders. CPMA represents over 870 companies growing, packing, shipping, and selling fresh fruit and vegetables in Canada. Our members are responsible for 90% of the fresh fruit and vegetable sales in Canada and make a significant contribution to Canada's economy in the amount of approximately $15 billion in GDP. The pandemic has highlighted that the Government of Canada must prioritize food as an essential item in framing our trade agreements, with the fundamental goal of supporting domestic markets while strengthening food security and ensuring product diversity. It is also critical that the government support all Canadian agriculture and food products in trade negotiations and not prioritize certain sectors to the detriment of others. CPMA cannot understate the critical importance of CUSMA in supporting our integrated supply chains. Our partners in CUSMA, particularly the United States, are by far Canada's largest trading partner when it comes to fresh produce, both in imports and exports. There are also many companies which operate across all 3 jurisdictions. In looking to the 2026 review, I would like to highlight 3 areas of focus. First, over the past number of years, we have seen some push coming from U.S. growers on trade actions, including an attempt to impose seasonal tariffs on certain fresh fruit and vegetable commodities to protect U.S. domestic producers from what they described as unfair competition from imports, which was not validated. Between 2020 and 2022, the U.S. International Trade Commission also undertook a safeguard investigation into blueberry imports, as well as a fact-finding investigation regarding cucumber and squash imports. Investigations into strawberry and bell pepper imports were also launched, but ultimately stalled. Thankfully, the Commission's findings were ultimately in Canada's favour, but the process cost Canadian businesses and governments significant amounts of time and legal costs. There are concerns that these types of investigations will raise again under a new administration south of the border. I will note that CPMA once managed the U.S. duties for produce and for our industry, which were phased out under the Canada-U.S. Free Trade Agreement and then NAFTA, along with phasing out of duties with Mexico and Chile. The Government of Canada should look at opposing any reintroduction of any types of duties as we on our industry as we look at the 2026 CUSMA review. Second, Canada's free trade agreements, including CUSMA, should support regulatory harmonization that can lead to adoption of higher standards and regulations across country, ensuring that products and services meet the same safety standards and quality standards while reducing regulatory burden and associated compliance costs for businesses. Plant health and pest risk management is one area of potential improvement when it comes to regulatory collaboration. Finally, CPMA would like to draw the committee's attention to the potential trade irritant related to the government's proposals relation to plastic packaging. Our North American partners have raised concerns that the introduction of the Federal Plastics Registry may violate the environmental and trading provisions under CUSMA, including the requirement to disclose proprietary information such as composition of packaging. Other concerns with the registry include the lack of clear guidelines on registration duties and accountability across the supply chain, as well as the increased risk of supply chain disruptions due to discrepancies with existing supply chain data systems. ECC's proposed actions in the form of the Pollution Prevention Notice Plan for primary food packaging, as well as proposed labeling recycling content regulations, also contain requirements which are highly problematic to the North American fresh produce industry. The combination of these actions, if implemented, could mean a significant disruption to our industry and the impact of over 160 different countries who ship to Canada. There is also concerns that the proposed regulatory unfairness or regulations create an unfairness around the focus, around the delivery of our products domestically and internationally. The continuation of a free trade framework for fruit and vegetables under CUSMA is vital as we navigate a world of high food inflation and growing production challenges. In closing, as representatives of a highly globally integrated industry, CPMA is supportive of the government's progressive trade agenda, which aligns to business growth and market access. And we hope we can continue that within a review of the current agreement. Thank you.
Thank you very much. On to Mr. Davies for 5 minutes, please.
Madam Chair, members of the committee and committee clerk, thank you for the opportunity to testify before you today on this important subject. My name is Graham Davis. I'm President and CEO of the Digital Media Association, or DiMA. I'm sorry that timing's meant I've been unable to be with you in person today. DiMA is the voice of music streaming, representing the world's leading audio streaming companies, who are the economic engine of the modern music industry. With a membership that includes Amazon Music, Apple Music, Pandora, Spotify, and YouTube, DiMA promotes and protects the ability for music fans to legally access and engage with music whenever and wherever they want, and for artists to reach fans and make new ones more easily. It's not that long ago that the music industry was in serious decline. DiMA's members have in large part rescued it from the harms of piracy by establishing a new sustainable business model that is quite different from broadcasting and other forms of entertainment. In music streaming, around 70% of the money from consumers is paid through to music labels, music publishers, and collective rights management organizations. By way of a comparison, a commercial radio station in Canada is likely to pay less than 9% to the music rights holders. In exchange for the large proportion of music streaming revenues being paid through to the rights holders, our members rightfully expect those rights holders to not only, of course, fairly and appropriately pay the songwriters and performing artists they represent, but also to invest in the search for and development and promotion of a diverse and talented pipeline of new Canadian creative talent. Investment in creative output has always been the role of record labels and music publishers in Canada and everywhere else in the world. And again, that role justifies the large proportion of revenues paid through to those entities. Nonetheless, streaming services have taken it upon themselves to improve upon the prior model. DiMA's members also invest in local teams and resources that discover, develop, and promote Canadian artists. This has resulted in a great success story for Canada, with artists like Charlotte Cadan from Montreal, Tate McRae from Calgary developing domestic and global followings through the power and reach of streaming. I explain these economics to provide context to the government's implementation of the Online Streaming Act. As you may know, earlier this week, the CRTC introduced an unprecedented and discriminatory 5% tax on music streaming services. We are concerned that this action will undermine the investments made by DEMA's members in the Canadian music industry and may also have unintended consequences for consumers, particularly younger Canadians who are the predominant users of music streaming services in Canada. In general, rising costs can lead to rising prices, and we have identified nothing in the new regulations to soften the impact of this economic rule. To add to these negative impacts, the CRTC decision is now forcing US and international companies to pay large sums into a fund they cannot access. In addition to the upward pressure on consumer affordability, we believe this is a discriminatory trade policy that comes on top of other digital trade-related concerns. Leading trade commentators are warning that the cultural exemption in the current agreement does not apply, and even if it did, it explicitly allows the US to countervail for equivalent value in such situations. Why then, given the other members of today's panel, should, for example, Canadian beef farmers or the auto sector be expected to pay the price for this misguided and onerous regulation? The US Secretary of the Treasury and the US Ambassador to Canada have expressed strong opposition to any discriminatory taxes against US firms. On the same day the CRTC announced this 5% tax, the American Chamber of Commerce in Canada declared that it violates Canada's obligations under the trade agreement. The US Chamber has strongly objected also. DEMA and its members have worked tirelessly to inform and educate the Canadian government and the CRTC as to why the Online Streaming Act is bad for Canada. This has been to no avail, though we continue to encourage them to change course. My intention today is to raise awareness of this developing situation with honourable members of this committee and encourage you to keep close scrutiny on the implementation of this legislation. DEMA and its members wish to continue supporting and investing in Canadian music and culture. We are concerned that the implementation of this legislation jeopardises the ability for us to meaningfully do so. Thank you. Merci beaucoup. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much, Mr. Davies. Ms. Trenberg, please.
Well, thank you very much for the opportunity to present to this committee on behalf of the National Cattle Feeders Association. So NCFA is the national voice for cattle feeders and a critical component of the beef value chain. At approximately 1 year of age, calves move from a cow-calf farm to feedlots, and there they're fed a high-energy ration, which brings them very quickly to market weight. And feedlots are important to efficiently produce consistent, high-quality beef in quantities that are required for domestic and export markets year-round. So Canada's beef industry contributes around $21.8 billion to the national GDP. Our beef sector is very export dependent. Each year we export approximately half of the cattle that we raise, and the United States accounts for around 75% of those exports. So while our sector works to diversify in other global markets, the current geopolitical environment can often make this quite challenging. So over the last 10 years, our Canadian live cattle and beef exports have seen tremendous growth, with the United States being behind the majority of that. And while this is good news, our sector is disproportionately dependent on the American market, and thus the 2026 CUSMA review is of great importance to us. Our interest in CUSMA 2026 review is rooted in the highly integrated North American beef industry. It provides benefits to both sides of the border, and in practicality, Canada and the U.S. beef industries operate within a single North American market where processed beef and live cattle move across the border relatively unimpeded and tariff-free. So imports for feed are also a critical part of this integrated market with the U.S. Increasing volatile political environments, not only in the U.S. but globally, really makes CUSMA and the predictability that it provides even more important than ever. So if I go directly into the CUSMA review, NCFA calls to the Canadian government to do three things: do no harm, improve market access where possible, and focus on regulatory cooperation. We call upon the Canadian government to ensure that no new tariff or trade restricting measures result from this review. With skyrocketing input costs, unpredictable supply chains, and extreme weather conditions, the beef industry is simply not positioned to sustain a trade disruption with any of our trading partners. Canada must enter the CUSMA review with a strong and clear position that's not limited by the interests of one sector. Both countries have trade-sensitive commodities, but the goal of this review must be to increase market access in each other's markets. With a North American integrated industry, we call for an increased focus on regulatory alignment and cooperation. This can include aligning rules on transportation, disease control measures, inspection requirements, so that trade within North America can be unimpeded and consistent with rules. An equal commitment to the delivery of timely border services is essential to meet required inspections by the USDA officials and vets when shipping live cattle. We need to push for an increase to USDA border crossings and not closings or reductions of these services. And finally, it's important that we have equivalency in rules for the approval and use of new products so Canadian and American farmers have access to the same tools at the same time and are able to move live animals freely across the border, knowing that products are accepted on both sides of the border. So we urge the committee to ensure the government protects the economic and competitive benefits that lives within the CUSMA agreement. Thank you.
Very much. On to questions from our colleagues. Mr. General, for 6 minutes, please.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you to the witnesses for taking the time to be with us here and join us on a Thursday afternoon. Quickly to Mr. Davies, I guess a simple yes or no answer. Would you agree that Canada's digital service tax proposal will undermine Canada-US trading relationship?
My response relates to music streaming specifically. As outlined, we do see trade problems with the Online Streaming Act.
Do you agree then that the Online Streaming Act would run counter to Canada's commitments under the OECD and G20 inclusive framework on base erosion and profit shifting?
So thank you for the question. I'm not a trade expert, so in terms of my testimony today, it's to raise the concern that we're seeing from our members and a number of trade experts raising concerns about this very recent decision. The decision was only made this week, so there's a lot of gathering around as to the implications of it. For the committee, if there are specific questions like that on wider trade questions, I'm very happy to take those back and come back to the committee.
It would be great to get your organization's opinion on that indeed. So I'll take you up on that if you don't mind returning to the committee. You did raise the issues during your testimony on what the U.S. to countervail for equivalent value in such situations, and then your next sentence was, for example, on beef farmers and the auto sector. I guess could you expand on what exactly you mean by those two examples?
Yeah, of course. They're only used by way of example. Obviously, we are keen that the future trade discussions, everyone's objective is that they are as smooth as possible. So we are just flagging that we see this as an emerging problem, and it wouldn't be for us to comment on how that could impact the future CUSMA review. But clearly, I mentioned some other parties because they're on the panel here today. That was the main reason for calling them out.
So would it be reasonable to assume then from your comments that if this were to continue to go ahead, then the beef farmers and auto sector would presumably pay a price for the regulation?
We're raising a concern that if this does continue and feeds into the CUSMA review, that it could impact other industries.
I guess trying to get a sense as to then why would you include that in part of your testimony? Is it because is it through experience? Is it through conversations you've had that if this continues, that there will be ramifications on other sectors?
Correct. Raising the fear that there will be ramifications on other sectors. The reason for purely calling out those was because they're on this panel with me here today. There's been no dialogue with them, or there's no research into directly whether they would be targeted. So that was not the intended inference. It was more by way of example. Okay.
I'm going to then ask Ms. Tranberg her comments on those particular comments from the Mr. Davies when he references that there could be ramifications on your sector.
I can't speak for his industry, but I'm making the assumption, listening to his testimony, that he is simply saying that it would have ramifications to the general public, part of which would be our sector and our industry. That's my assumption.
Would you be concerned that there are some other levies that are being put on U.S. Organizations such as the streamers, that there could be potential on your industry or other industries?
I would need to understand what those ramifications would be before I could comment.
Let's hypothetically say CRTC imposed a 5% base tax on streaming services. Then would, we have a letter from a number of, I think it's 19 congressmen here that have indicated that they are concerned about this. And I understand you and Mr. Davies are in two different sectors, but through his comments, he's indicated that he's concerned that this might have a larger impact, and that's where I like your opinion. If you could also indicate if you're also concerned that this would have a larger impact on sectors like yours.
It's a very difficult thing to answer, but I will say that right now in the agriculture industry, we're very concerned about a number of different pile-on activities that seem to be adding up, making our industry much less competitive than it certainly has been in the past. And so if this is an additional tax that would add to that, then obviously we would be concerned. But at this point in time, I can't specifically answer because I don't understand what the specific ramifications would be.
Thank you very much. Mr. Sidhu for 6 minutes.
Yes, thank you, Madam Chair, and thanks to the witnesses for being here today and sharing your insightful comments with us. My first question would be for Mr. Volpe on the screen. Mr. Volpe, I've talked a lot about in this committee about the importance of having healthy and vibrant trade corridors. And we know that the one in Windsor is definitely very vibrant. Lots of trade flows through that crossing, very important crossing to Canada. We have the Gordie Howe Bridge that's coming up there, and the two spans are mere meters away from being connected. What would this bridge mean for your industry, and what do you think it would mean for trade, especially considering that you've now opened your first office in Windsor? Congratulations.
Thank you. Look, I think we don't have to look too far to understand why having one bridge privately owned by a foreign entity is an issue. In terms of the volume of traffic that could get across the Ambassador Bridge, the decision to widen that bridge comes from a private party. And, for years, I think the industry has said that it would benefit from that, and that private party is motivated by things that private parties are motivated by, return on investment, et cetera, raising the capital to do it. The industry lobbied for decades, successive governments, to do another bridge. This Gordie Howe Bridge provides some insurance that if the next band of lunatics that wants to barricade a bridge shows up, maybe there'll be another one that's open, but also that this is a modern infrastructure, a wider infrastructure that provides a couple of logistics options to get across. $100 million worth of goods travel in either direction every day in the automotive sector from Windsor to Detroit. So, I think it's probably the best money that could have been spent on infrastructure for the Canadian auto sector.
Thank you, Mr. Volpe. I know we're all looking forward to the completion of the bridge, which I think is slated for next year. I'll turn now to Mr. Harvey. Mr. Harvey, our government has launched our Team Canada-U.S. engagement strategy being led by Minister Ng, Minister François-Philippe Champagne, and Ambassador Hillman. In terms of your advocacy efforts with some of your U.S. counterparts, what do you think the government should be doing in terms of what you're hearing? Where should we be focused on in terms of maybe some of your conversations?
Sure. I think the most important thing is to explain to the Americans when CUSMA is good for them and not always come at from the perspective of explaining to them why CUSMA is good for Canada. So if you look at some of our members, we're in these deeply integrated supply chains. So for instance, Ms. Tranberg was mentioning the connections between the cattle feeders here and the plants on the other side of the border. I mean, we're really producing together. So there's Americans who have a deep interest in the bilateral trading relationship, and we need to be bringing that up with them and getting them to speak up in favor of the relationship. We're doing things together. It's not just that we're exporting things to the U.S.
Absolutely, and I'd like to hear from Mr. Lemaire on some of his conversations and ongoing advocacy in the U.S.
I'll reiterate Mr. Harvey's comments. We're a fully integrated market with greenhouse producers, as an example, operating in all three countries. Whether automotive, beef, grains, whatever the case may be, we need to ensure that we have a free flow, open delivery of product across jurisdictions with limited or no regulatory burdens to slow the movement of those products, especially when we're talking about perishable food.
In terms of regions or states down in the U.S., is there a focus on certain regions that you'd like the government to focus on or regions that you're interested in?
So the strength and influence of the region, I think, and I mentioned with the potential change of administration in the U.S. and the strength of voice of Florida and some of the stronger Republican states, I think we need to pay attention to those voices, understand what they're saying, and to Mr. Harvey's comments, ensure they understand the benefits of the trade agreement and where the opportunity for market is and collaborative delivery of business.
Okay, thank you for that. Mr. Volpe, I'm going to turn back to you. I've got about a minute left. Same question to you in terms of your advocacy efforts with your counterparts down in the U.S. What's working? What do you think we need to focus on? I think you're on mute there.
Spend a lot of time with our counterparts in the U.S. as well as in Mexico in a coordinated effort to align our messaging. Part suppliers in all three countries really have the same dynamics. We're all trying to serve car makers who are selling to an American consumer. I think the Canadian Embassy has done a very good job, including the Trade Commissioner Service that serves the various auto states in coordinating the message that we do this all this work together. I did note that the ISED minister and the minister at Trade are part of a coordinated effort with the ambassador to move that Team Canada effort forward. And I will note that includes members of the opposition parties over the last couple of years that have been very active and very helpful, as the message coming from Canada is nonpartisan. And I'll note the work of people like Randy Hoback there.
Great. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you. Yes. We have Mr. Hoback at our committee today filling in, so it's nice to see that he's here.
Oh.
On to Monsieur Savard Tremblay, please, for 6 minutes.
Merci, Madame la Présidente. Merci.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you to all the witnesses. Listen, Mr. Harvey, I was surprised to hear you say that C-282 had not been reviewed or had never been reviewed by this House or had not been reviewed by House. So it's one thing to say that you're not agree with it and that the Senate is going to look at it, but to say that we didn't do our work in an in-depth way, this is a process that we did 2 times. We did it at the legislature and then we did it here. And I was one of the spokesperson for that bill, and we toured Quebec. We did an information tour. Now, with regard to the last process, it went further than the first one. it was a very normal process. There was a tabling and first reading, a debate at second reading. It was adopted, and then we brought it to committee. We did a study with a certain number of sessions. We invited witnesses, experts that were for or against, groups that were concerned, and then groups that were against it, groups that supported it. So we heard all possible arguments, and we weighed everything, and we passed it at the committee level and then in third reading, and now it's in the Senate. So in my view, it was a good process, and you don't disagree with that. That's democracy. But to say that there hasn't been an in-depth review of it, well, you might think that it's an insufficient process, but this is the same process that we use for all bills. Otherwise, I would ask you to review your words before you speak them. So, Mr. Volpe, in January 2023, following a complaint by Canada and Mexico, Canada was found. The decision was made in favor of Canada and Mexico. The conflict was based on a technical issue that required that by 2025, 75% of parts and essential parts be manufactured in the United States to be tariff-free. So what are the irritants that are still present and that could be solved at the review stage?
Thank you. I think on that specific issue, all three countries agreed that in the original text and interpretation of the USMCA, that there were specific local content thresholds for different types of parts. Once those parts were deemed to have met those thresholds, and that was ostensibly 65 to 75%, then those parts would be deemed to be 100% compliant in the vehicle calculation. The local content requirement in a vehicle is set at 75%. So if I qualified my armrest or my wheels or my transmission, then that number would start for that component at 100%, rolled up to 100% is the term that we use. The new administration, the Biden administration, said, actually, what we would like to see is for the actual local content number, whatever that is, 66%, 83%, 94%, to be the one used. Canada and Mexico successfully appealed that, said that is not what we agreed on. That is not the way the industry works. Even though I represent component suppliers, we always argued during the NAFTA negotiations, if we tighten the restrictions too much, the penalty for automakers for not meeting the compliance number is a 2.5% MFN tariff. And so they just turn around and just pay the tariff, and then maybe not be guided at all by the rules of origin. Canada and Mexico won that. We're waiting for the Americans to give a report on how they're going to comply with that, and they've been silent since.
Parfait. On a aussi vu les États-Unis il y a 3 semaines.
3 weeks ago, the United States, again, it's a question for you, took steps to impose new duties for goods coming from China on things like EVs, batteries, essential minerals. So how do we avoid Canada becoming an access door for China? We know how Canada is very laxist when it comes to imports from products coming from forced labor, etc. So how do we avoid becoming a gateway for that, given the greater distrust of this by the Americans?
I've said publicly, I've said privately, I've been speaking with the various departments of government that are responsible for this since last October, that we need to be in sync with the Americans. 80% of the market for our finished goods is the American market, and I think the Americans understand it as we have access to their market, we need to protect their goods' access to our market. In November, first week of November of 2023, the APMA went to Washington to meet White House officials, energy, treasury, and economy officials to say the Chinese are aggressively eroding market-driven companies' market in Mexico, displacing market-driven FDI into North America via Mexico, and have really shown us what their intentions are with a very aggressive triple-digit increase in Europe, and we should do something about it. We are very glad that the Americans have come up with a 100% tariff on EVs and 25% on some critical materials. And we think the government of Canada, look, do your consultation, but very quickly concluded that consultation, which is rather public. All the related parties in our industry say, match it and show the Americans we're just as dedicated to protecting their market access as they are to ours.
Okay, thank you very much. Mr. Cannings, please, for 6 minutes.
Well, thank you. Thank you to everyone for being here today. I'm going to start with Mr. Lemaire of the Canadian Produce Marketing Association. I represent a riding that has a lot of, especially fruit growing, a lot of soft fruits, cherries, peaches, apricots, etc. You mentioned the particular problem of perishable food crossing the border. You can't have it sitting there waiting for some dispute to be worked out. Can't go to a CUSMA panel and see what those cherries are going to face. So I'm just wondering what is in the present CUSMA right now to deal with that? Is there some sort of rapid action mechanism that can be applied for when what often happens, you have a big cherry crop in Washington State and suddenly our market is flooded with Washington cherries, very low prices, we call it dumping. And that has a huge impact on our domestic market. I'm just wondering what mechanisms are available to the Canadian industry to counteract that, and whether we use them, and if they're not in the present agreement, should they be?
The agreement does hold anti-dumping mechanisms in place. The complexity of those mechanisms require demonstration of production and sale of under-priced products. The process that we need to ensure is in place is that we're always looking at valid data, sound science, and expediency of review when putting it in play. The expediency of review, you've hit on the head, it doesn't exist. It's a very slow process, and it's many years after the whether it is a dumping situation or suspected dumping. It's already completed, and we're working in the past as opposed to the present. The solution, complex, a rapid action group would be ideal. The formation of that group within a CUSMA framework is a highly innovative way of approaching it.
Because we need to, if we suddenly see this happening, we need to put those anti-dumping levies on right now, and we can worry about the panel decisions perhaps later, I'm assuming, but we need action before those cherries turn to mush.
Yeah, we have to ensure the imposition of, and we go back to some of the discussions on the retaliatory tariff discussion around digital media. It's the one watch out we have to be careful on relative to imposition of any levies or duties without the data and science to validate. It's the only caution I would give, but working with a rapid action format could provide us the springboard into delivery of the right response in the situation of a dumping environment.
Right. And the other perishable fruit situation crossing the border is the PACA Deemed Trust agreement. We have a bill put forward this time by Scott Davidson of the Conservatives. It's in the Senate right now. Well, I was just going to ask you, where is that, and what can we do to get that going?
So we have to give the House and parliamentarians credit. You've kept the Senate very busy, and they've made the decision to focus on House priorities only. And we were moving into the Banking Committee to review Bill C-280, and that has been postponed now until the fall. I was actually to testify this morning around the benefits of market stabilization and trade, because if we can introduce the bankruptcy tool for the fresh fruit and vegetable sector, we will regain a trading tool, preferential access to a trading tool with the U.S. that will provide a clear strategy on sustainability for our fruit and vegetable growers when we ship south in the event of a dispute.
So are you still confident that will happen in the fall? It's just a timing
I had
issue?
full House support. I understand we have support from the Senate, but I am not a gambler. I'd like to see discussion. I'd like to see it cross the finish line as fast as possible, and the Senate move it back with no amendments and support.
Okay. Okay, 1 minute. Where will I go? I think I'll go to Mr. Volpe again. If you could just maybe help me understand, this situation with the change in the roll-up agreement and the panel win by Canada and Mexico. You say the U.S. is not in compliance. What does that really mean for us, and where is that process?
Well, you went to the wrong guy with 1 minute left, but I'll say the difference between our interpretation and their interpretation was deemed to be wrong by the panel, would require more local content. I think they were trying to drive for more American content in part to be able to qualify a vehicle. The challenges in a lot of important component classes like electronics or wiring harnesses, they don't exist in North America. And so you can drive a car maker to a number that is unachievable, and the only penalty if that car maker doesn't achieve it is a 2.5% tariff. And so we said, if they choose not to go on the 2.5% tariff, then they don't even have to meet the 75%. They could go to 65% or whatever works. And so we really hope the Americans listen to their own industry, who has been telling them that they all agreed on the interpretation we all negotiated, and do the right thing and comply with the panel.
Thank you very much. Mr. Hoback for 5 minutes.
And I want to thank the committee members for giving me 5 minutes here to talk about the USMCA. I have a passion for this trade deal and seeing it go forward and making sure that we thin that border as much as we possibly can. In regards to, maybe I'll start off with you, Mr. Lemaire, plastics. We've heard that issue and we're down in the States about it being an issue. From California, of all places, the most environmental state there is. How do you see the legislation coming forward in plastics? What could be the possibility outcomes? And what does that mean for the cost of food here in Canada?
Deloitte has published.
We're very fast.
Deloitte published a report showing a 30% increase in food costs based on the proposed P2 notice and plastic strategy currently being proposed. We saw Congressman Sessions provide a letter to the ambassador identifying concerns under CUSMA relative to Chapter 24, Section 2, 4, and 5. Section 2, 4, and 5 that articulates concern that I noted in my testimony. It's significant. No one is saying that they don't want to try and address problematic plastics and find its path.
Because I only got so much time. Mr. Volpe, we talked about electric vehicles, and we talked about the fact that the U.S. went and put a tax on electric vehicles coming in from China. What happens if we see circumvention starting to happen? And I'll use an example. There was 800 containers that have been rejected in U.S. ports that now was rumored that possibly could have come through Canadian ports because they've never been inspected. What would that mean for the Canadian auto sector, and what could it mean for other sectors in regards to a relationship with the U.S.?
I don't know about the specific issue you're talking about, but in general, if we're seen as the place for Chinese vehicles to land at a lower price, and then displacing sales of vehicles manufactured by market-driven players in the U.S. I mean, if I was sitting at USTR, I'd take that as a signal that I'm not, that Canada isn't as committed to this partnership and defending Fortress North America against subsidized, centrally planned players.
Even if we've seen it starting to creep through like Chinese steel, Chinese electronics in through Mexico, would that also be a concern for Canadian manufacturers?
Sure, I think for Canadian manufacturers who are heavily invested in Mexico, who are out buying raw materials at market-driven prices, I think we've expressed that concern for years during the NAFTA renegotiations and since, and the Americans are very sensitive to that, both sides of the House.
Mr. Davies, you talked about the CRTs releasing this week. So what does that mean for companies like Netflix and those that doing video productions here in Canada, who have already invested heavily in Canada in regards to doing productions here? If they're now paying a 5% tax, will they still continue to invest in Canada and have productions happening here in Toronto and Vancouver and Montreal? Or will that money dry up and actually just be used to pay for the CRTC tax?
Thank you for the question. I mean, my response is on behalf of the music streaming companies, but I think your question applies to them as well, that very much our members have invested really significantly in teams and lots of infrastructural investments to support music streaming in Canada. That's all because consumers want access to Canadian music. You know, that's good for the experience.
Again, I only got 5 minutes. So I'm going to cut you off there quickly.
Sure.
How about the global tax, the 3% tax that was announced in the budget? U.S. companies are now going to be paying that, yet Canadian companies won't be paying that in the U.S. Can you explain to me why Canada would move ahead of the U.S. and other countries around the world on a global sales tax, and why would put us in that situation? Similar with the digital sales tax, it's doing the exact same thing.
Sorry, I'm not briefed on that issue. I'd be happy to follow up afterwards.
On that issue?
I was briefed. I'm able to talk to the Online Streaming Act, which is 5%, if that's what you...
Oh, so you didn't talk about the global sales tax or digital sales tax?
No.
So your members have no issue on that?
My members almost certainly will have strong views on that. I'm not briefed to mention that today, but I'd be happy to take the question back and come back.
Okay, I'm going to move on then. We've got a Team Canada approach, and Mr. Volpe, I agree with you. It worked very well in 2017, 2018. Working with Wayne Easter and Brian Massey, and I know the ambassador at the time, yourself. It was a very strong push to make sure Canada was taken care of. What I am concerned about is I heard another announcement of a Team Canada, but I'm hearing that a lot of Canadians haven't been asked to be involved, including none of the opposition parties have been asked to be involved. Now, I'm kind of curious, Mr. Lemaire, has either Minister Ng or Minister Champlain reached out to your organization to talk about Team Canada?
Unfortunately, not as of yet.
How about you, Mr. Harvey?
No, we've reached out to the government and made some invitations to come speak.
Yeah, okay. Mr. Volpe, you've probably been reached out, I assume?
I'm always on Team Canada.
But have you been reached out by the minister? As am I. As is everybody in this room, I'm sure. But have the ministers reached out to you directly to get your guidance? Because you could provide tremendous insight.
Yes. Yes, they did. And some of my guidance was to call the rest of you. So, yes.
Okay, I did. You can't control if they don't listen to you, can you?
Yeah.
That's it. I'm sorry, Mr. Hoback.
How about Janice?
To get
One
a
more.
lot in that 5 minutes. But,
okay, thank you, witnesses.
And Mr. Volpe, I understand that you have to leave us, so thank you very much for giving us your very important information and your knowledge. Okay.
Thank you for having me. Thank you.
Mr. Miao for 5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And first, I'd like to thank all the witnesses for being here today for this important study. And before I begin, I'd like to take this opportunity to commemorate the important occasion of the 80th anniversary of D-Day and Battle of Normandy. And I'd like to invite all of us to remind and honor and to pay tribute to the brave heroes who served in the Second World War. And let us always remember their service, sacrifice, and the legacy of courage, ensuring that their legacy guide us in fostering peace, justice, and economic prosperity in this world. And now, Madam Chair, for you, I'd like to also direct my following question to Mr. Harvey and Mr. Lemaire. And as we enter June, and summer is just around the corner, we have witnessed over 300,000 hectares of forests have been burned down due to wildfire this year. And extreme climate events due to climate changes are threatening our agriculture and agri-food sectors. And our federal government is building a sustainable climate resilience economy that will bring generation benefits to not just our agriculture, but also our agri-food sector. And this is a common standard in environmental cooperation in the CUSMA. Could you please share with this committee your perspective on this environmental commitment made by not only Canada, but US, Mexico, in relationship to supporting this sector? Maybe.
So I
Mr.
could
Harvey?
say, I mean, Canadian agri-food exporters have a very good carbon profile with low carbon production, constantly working to improve the technology. We think it's very important that sustainability at a global level not be used as a disguised trade barrier. But we think that sustainable trade has a very key role playing in reaching our sustainability goals.
I'm a founding member of the National Agri-Food Sustainability Index that was created to find the benchmarks to gauge our strength in sustainability within agri-food. And it's a vital piece moving forward. In agreement with Mr. Harvey, this cannot be a trading tool. This has to be a competitive tool. This has to be a fabric of how we do business and cannot add cost pressure down on the farmers, whether it's Canada, the US, or Mexico. The only one that pays in the end will be the consumer. So we have to ensure that we develop a strategy that effectively leverages sustainability while at the same time enables business.
And you mentioned about the sustainability. Can you talk about the contribution of this trade partnership in the agriculture and agri-food sector as well?
The trade relationship from the fresh fruit and vegetable sector, we've seen growth and development within our trading relationships and an increased export strategy with our U.S. partners, as well as growth with the Mexican market. Where we've seen some challenges actually is in our own domestic internal trading framework. And a good example, when you talk about the wildfires, British Columbia is looking for rootstock for wine grapes as well as their tree food industry. In Ontario, they have available rootstock. However, they cannot sell that without fumigation to BC. We need an exemption for that. So it's an internal trade barrier, non-tariff trade barrier of moving product from one province to another. This is some of the issues we see domestically.
Thank you for sharing that. And Mr. Harvey, you have anything to add?
The CUSMA agreement has means of managing disputes around non-scientific trade barriers. So a good example is Mexico, which has banned GMO corn. The United States has opposed that using the dispute settlement mechanism, and the Canadian government has supported the U.S. position, and we supported Canada supporting the U.S. position. So we think that the CUSMA agreement provides a way to manage disputes like this to come to science-based decision-making.
And some of the sustainable measures that our government has introduced, such as the National Adaptation Strategy to combat climate change, could you please share with this committee how the environmental measures are helping the sectors to combat climate change while securing also competitiveness between our trading partners?
The water component is a fundamental factor. Water will be a future challenge for everyone, and that's the first and foremost step within our sustainability strategy, especially within a North American context and our trading relationship within agriculture. And how do we solidify and manage our sustainability framework and drive forward with ensuring everyone has the necessary water for production?
Thank you very much. Your time is up. On to Mr. Savard-Tremblay for 2.5 minutes, please.
Oui, mais en fait, toujours Monsieur Volpe.
Well, again, Mr. Volpe, would you have any suggestions for us to protect the North American markets?
Had left. When he
oui,
came on,
bon.
he said it was only there till 4:30.
Est-ce qu'on a toujours un représentant de l'association?
Do we still have any representatives from the association present? Is there still a representative from the association present with us?
Merci. Alors, dans ce cas-là, je vais...
In that case, I'll ask a broader question and I'll turn it to any of our witnesses to answer. We know that Catherine Tai, the representative, indicated that disputes, in fact, should be part of this joint study to the extent that we were unable to resolving the dispute using only the dispute settlement mechanisms. And I know that that has already led to a number of conflicts. And I think nobody wants to see any further trade disputes. So how would you comment on this? And what would your recommendations be with respect to the systems that exist? Where should we exactly be vigilant?
C'est une bonne question, and I'll speak to the question that was made around the deemed trust discussions. In Canada, if we move forward with the mechanism around financial protection, Bill C-280, that's in front of the Senate, it's one of the other tools that enables, so working around and within CUSMA, because it is built within the framework of a trinational modeling, it gives us the access to a dispute resolution model within a preferential system that no others have internationally. So Canadian growers in the fresh fruit and vegetable industry and exporters would be able to access that dispute resolution tool. It just means moving forward our own bankruptcy protection here to enable the U.S. to reinstate that preferential access due to the reciprocity nature that they're requesting. It's slightly outside of CUSMA, but it's founded within the context of the North American Free Trade Agreement.
Notice that Mr. Davies has his hand up. Did he want to add something to your question? Mr. Davies?
Yes, please. Thank you. So thank you for the question. DEMA's members and comments made by numerous US and Canadian stakeholders, including the US Chamber of Commerce, USTR, US lawmakers, academics, and other experts, indicate that introducing a 5% tax that forces US and international companies to pay into a fund they cannot access creates a risk of this becoming a trade irritant. So we would encourage members of this committee to review the comments made by all of these stakeholders and review the implementation of the Online Streaming Act.
Mr. Cannings for 2.5 minutes, please.
Well, thank you. I'd like to turn to Ms. Tranberg, if she's still there, and talk about, we just heard a brief mention of non-tariff barriers just now. I'm just wondering, we hear a lot about this situation when we have meat exports, for instance, between Canada and the UK, Canada and the EU. I'm just wondering what your association, your members are concerned about, if at all, around non-tariff barriers that might hinder the trade of cattle, especially live cattle, back and forth between Canada and the U.S.
Thank you for the question. I think that one of the things we're seeing around the voluntary labeling, the voluntary product of U.S. or PUSMA labeling that just went in, we were very concerned, and I guess it's sort of a wait and see on how much this will actually impact trade, being that it is voluntary and not mandatory. As we mentioned, the trade between Canada and the U.S. On beef, for example, it's a very open border. In 2021, for example, 638,000 head of cattle were imported from Canada, and then at the same time, there was an export of about 377,000 head of cattle that went to the U.S. So this goes back and forth. So given that there is such an open trade between the two countries, the limits around labeling is something that is a concern, and certainly hope that will not become a trade irritant.
That's fine. I'll leave it there. Thanks.
Mr. Baldinelli for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and I'd like to thank the witnesses for being with us today. And I'm going to begin with Mr. Lemaire, if I could. And you spoke in response to my colleague, Mr. Hoback, about the plastics registry and how it might impact under CUSMA rules currently. And you had spoken, I think many of the witnesses here today have talked about the need for regulatory harmonization as we move forward with our partners, both Mexico and the United States. But in your response, talking about the impact probably that might happen with food prices because of this, and you talked about a Deloitte study and a 30% increase in food costs as a result. If you could, I think our committee would benefit if you could share that Deloitte study with us for our purposes, I think that would be hugely important. And then you've also spoken about C280. And C280 is a private member's bill of our colleague, Scott Davidson. And he's spearheading that, and it's in the Senate right now. It received unanimous support in the House of Commons, and I believe the same in the Senate as well. And I think this legislation will potentially pave the way for reinstating the Perishable Agricultural Commodity Act protection in the U.S. for Canadian growers. And so what does the government need to do to push for this to happen as part of CUSMA or even prior to CUSMA?
We need to get it out of the Senate unamended. It has to get out. It has to go into force. We need to demonstrate to the United States, and I was fortunate enough to go to D.C. with some parliamentarians and some senators to meet.
I think Mr. Davidson on that trip as well?
Mr. Davidson was on that trip. We went with a group of Liberals and Conservatives and senators, and we met with U.S. officials, both congressmen and USDA officials, to get confirmation that all we need to do to get privileged access back to PACA in the U.S. is to implement Bill C-280 as written. That was confirmed.
Excellent. Thank you so much. Mr. Davies, I just want to confirm again what you had mentioned in your testimony about in general rising costs can lead to rising prices, and nothing in the new regulations will soften the impact. And you're talking about the 5% tax. Now, through your association, have you determined this implementation of this 5% tax, what that will do, what that will take out of the sector in terms of revenue?
Yeah, thank you for the question. It's still very early. The decision in terms of the 5% was only made earlier this week. So our members are still working through what this means. I think that, for our members, as you would imagine, I'm unable to talk to what their individual strategies would be and on such matters like pricing, but we have seen, and hopefully I've explained, that the margin here is very tight. And so where the costs are going up, we have seen in other territories that sadly has resulted in those costs being passed through to the consumer. So that was the risk and the concern that we're highlighting sort of so soon after this decision being taken.
Thank you. Now, back to Mr. Lemaire. When we talk about, you had three points in your presentation about what we should do moving forward. And, it's the notion of trying to protect against the push by growers in the U.S. for seasonal tariffs. And that'll be coming regardless. The notion of regulatory harmonization would be of a benefit. And again, the notion of the proposal on the plastics registry and your opposition to that. Now, have you shared your concerns, not only with the plastic registry, but also your comments on the regulatory harmonization and what you would like to see in terms of that with the government?
Yeah, we've continually provided the same commentary, and we haven't within the last few months, but ongoing basis, we provided the input around science-based, data-driven systems that are harmonized and equivalent across North America. In that approach, we can see an effective trade model that builds business both domestically and internationally.
Great. Thank you.
Mr. Arya, please, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Mr. Harvey, that Bill C-282 is passing through the Senate. I wished it did not become a law, but it looks as though it will, which prohibits Canadian International Trade Minister prohibits her from giving any further concessions on the dairy market or the supply managed sector in Canada. Do you think this will be an issue when the review comes up for CUSMA?
Right now, it's still in the Senate, and we're asking senators to apply their traditional sober second thought to this piece of legislation. We think that senators are going to see that it's highly problematic for Canada's trade policy. What it does, we're not arguing against supply management. We're not arguing against the protection of supply management. Our trade negotiators are instructed to protect supply management. What we think is problematic about this piece of potential legislation is that it would legislatively handcuff our trade negotiators. That's why a large group of recently retired trade negotiators spoke out against the legislation. Senator Harder, who's the critic of the bill in the Senate, read that into the record. We think the Senate's going to see that this is a problem. We have noticed in our discussions with senators that when we mention that we think it's going to be problematic for the Kuzma review, they notice that. We've heard reference to it, and we met with counterparts at the World Trade Organization Ministerial Conference in Abu Dhabi. We met with American agri-food counterparts who expressed concern, and they're bringing that up with their elected representatives.
Mr. Harvey, I hope I was as optimistic as you, because I believe there are certain senators like Senator Garba, who is the sponsor of the bill there. Assuming that it gets passed, I feel that it is going to have a significant impact when the review comes up. Assuming it goes up, what do you think are the implications when they doing the review?
We think it's already having an impact, and that it makes us look unserious to our American partners. Nobody else in the world does this sort of legislative handcuffing of their trade negotiators. Again, it's normal to give instructions. It's not normal to do legislative handcuffing. I'm actually quite optimistic that the Senate Foreign Affairs and International Trade Committee will be making a recommendation to not move forward with the legislation or presenting amendments, and we think it's important that it do so.
As you mentioned, without this legislation, the Canadian supply and managed sector has been protected well during all the previous trade negotiations Canada had so far. In case it gets passed, reciprocity is very important in trade negotiations. So even if the US and Mexico may not want additional access, just to argue a point, they may demand concessions in other sectors. What are the sectors do you think will get affected?
I'd say across the board, what's problematic here is legislating in favor of just one sector and against the interests of all other sectors. We think an important thing in the Senate committee to be studied is the interest of other sectors outside of agri-food. My comment about the lack of depth in the study here was not about members of Parliament's level of work on the issue. The main problem we saw was that there weren't many witnesses called from sectors outside of agriculture. It left a very bad impression that it was an ag versus ag issue, which is not. Other sectors are also affected. But even inside agriculture, it's not necessarily a majority, it's a minority of the sector that wants this legislation.
I agree with you. In fact, I recall the committee work during that Bill C-282 thing. Mr. Lemire, on the same line of questions, what are your thoughts?
I concur with Mr. Harvey. Retaliatory levies are very possible, or a retaliatory action. Our hope is that there will be a sober second thought, and that either opposed and or returned with amendments would be the best course of action, and give the opportunity for the House to review and determine if we can move forward.
Okay.
In the current
Very quickly, you have 35 seconds remaining, sir.
Okay. If you don't have time to answer, my question is on any trade barriers that you find in the current agreement that needs to be addressed during the review. That is one. Secondly, if there anything in the current agreement that impacts the competitiveness that you guys need to be addressed in the review, and any regulatory alignment that would be best taken up during the review. If you have any comments on that, you can always provide us in writing so that we can certainly consider them.
If you would like to answer in writing to the clerk to those last comments that the member made, we would appreciate it. All right. All right. Thank you very much. We have completed round two. We have a draft report that we need to work on before the completion of this meeting. So I want to thank the witnesses for their participation as we continue to move forward with this review. So I will move suspension, and thank you again to all our witnesses.
Thank you.